I began excavating the ruins of Kandar with a group of my colleagues.
Talk to me.
My victim.
Time to go to sleep.
On Friday, September 22nd, I went to Howl-O-Scream, Tampa. This is like my 5th time going to this haunt. If you're familiar with Howl-O-Scream, you know that they usually will redo a lot of houses year over year, and this year was no exception. And there's actually only technically one new house, and I think they said 2 new scare zones, but I'll make an argument against that a little bit later in this video. I did just a normal pass, but I did manage to get through almost every house twice and almost every scare zone twice. There was one house, one scare zone that I didn't repeat. So as I'm going through this, while I am showing footage only from my first go around with the houses, my thoughts are going to be of the combination of both go-throughs when that's the case. The crowds on this night were a little lighter than what I'm used to. I believe I usually do this a week later in the year, most years. Part of me being in Tampa every year when this happens is part of me going to a family event. So it's usually basically the same time every year that I go. I think the family event was moved up a week, so me going to this was a little bit earlier in the season than it has been in the past. So with a bit of a lighter crowd, that did impact the lines and everything, but they also kind of ran the houses a little differently than they did, at least last year, and I want to say it was the same for years before that as well. I think in the past they've done a lot of very small groups going through the houses at a time. This year, the groups they were sending in were considerably larger than they have been in recent memory. It's not quite the conga line of Halloween Horror Nights where it's just everybody goes and you're just following the person in front of you and it's just a kind of constantly moving thing. But instead of being with a group of like 5 people, I was with a group probably of about 20 going through. So last year especially, I found a lot of times I was essentially isolated in the house. It felt like it was just me and the scare actors on a lot of points, unless I happened to catch up to the group ahead of me or whatever. But this time I was basically always around other attendees. Filming was allowed in these houses this year. Unfortunately, I forgot to check my camera settings before going through and didn't make any real adjustments for low light environments. So a lot of this is probably not going to be usable. I'm just going to put in the clips that look okay, and all of it's probably going to have to be digitally brightened. Sadly enough, when I filmed a bit later in the night on my cell phone, I think some of that footage came out better, but that was only in the scare zones and a lot of it was vertical video, so it doesn't help a whole lot here. In previous years, you were allowed to show up a bit on the early side. I forget what the time was exactly, but you were able to go in and kind of use the park until they shut down at around 6 o'clock and made the transition over. This year, I could not find a time to get in, and plus I had to work. So by the time I got into the park itself, it was about 6:45. They were still letting people in with Halloween. Have I been saying Halloween Horror Nights this whole time? Wow. They're still letting people in with Howl-O-Scream passes, giving you a wristband to show that you were supposed to be there. I kind of started wandering through the front section of the park. There was kind of a little merch shop in there. And I wandered off towards the right of the entrance where one of the first houses usually is. It does look like they had employees blocking off further access to the park. I think it was probably just where the scare zone began. So I'm guessing I probably could have gotten to the first house over there and probably Stranglewood Estates and maybe even gone over to Witch of the Woods, but I couldn't really venture deeper into the park at that point. I love this thing had no fence for years and years and years, and then some dumbass decides he wants to go walk around the alligator enclosure. Now we got a big ass fence here. So So because the haunt wasn't technically open yet, there was kind of a pre-line for the house up there, which was D.H. Baggum's Circus of Fear. And just on its own, I gotta say, it's kind of amazing. There was a circus-themed house, and it wasn't completely full of clowns. This is where they had Deathwater Bayou in past years. They have a nice little outside area where they've themed it. There's kind of like ticket booths and vendors and stuff, looking like you're about to enter a carnival tent. The fact that it's right next to Iron Gwazi, and that's kind of coming up on the side of the line, really does kind of help sell that theme. So as you go through, it is kind of like you're going through various tents and exhibits and stuff within the carnival. Sometimes you're inside for pretty much all the house, but you know, some areas are themed to look indoors, some areas are themed to look outdoors. There's a lot of murderous carnies jumping out at you with like axes and knives and stuff. You go through a fortune teller's cart, which has some cool theming, but not really any scares in it. Then you go through kind of like a midway games area with a freak show stage. There's an actor up on the stage and then like a crowd in front of him, which is mostly mannequins. There's another scene similar to that a bit later in, where there's like a performer on stage and then some dummies or whatever in seats, and then, you know, the scare actor on the stage is supposed to scare you or say stuff to you or whatever, and then maybe somebody in the crowd who isn't a dummy is supposed to jump up and scare you because you weren't expecting it. But in my two go-throughs of this, basically something was missing from either of these at one point or another. I'll talk about it further as we go on, but it does seem like there were a little bit fewer actors than they maybe needed for this night, and I don't know if it's because it's earlier in the season or if it's just a general problem. Another memorable scene is you're going through like rows of like makeup mirrors, like old-timey makeup mirrors, and then as you're going through them, you kind of get used to seeing reflections in all of them, and then one of them is actually a false mirror and somebody jumps out through the fake mirror at you. And then there is a small kind of little bit of an outdoor outro section of it, and you're back into the park. I decided to continue going around kind of a counterclockwise loop of the park. In previous years, I've tried to follow the numbers on the map, but this year they literally had the circus house as number 1, but then kind of like sent you darting back and forth across the park if you were to follow the numbers. So I didn't want to do that because that just seems like a mess. So I went over to a returning favorite of mine, Stranglewood Estate. I was actually at Busch Gardens just during the day, normal thing, back in like May, and they left this facade up. So this has been sitting there probably since last Halloween, as far as I know, fully themed out in the middle of the park during normal business hours, but being able to see it at night again with the cool lighting and fog effects is really cool. As you go through the doorway, there's like a person from the house beckoning you in on the lower floor, but then you can see up above you on like the second floor, there's like a bride character looming over you. One of the neat things with this front room, which I don't see in a lot of houses, is that you kind of go in and take a turn and loop around, but you could see the people who've already made that loop moving in the background. But because it's so dark, it's like you're kind of just seeing movement, and it kind of adds to that creep factor and a little bit of that foreboding effect. The whole thing is really nicely themed, really well built. It really does feel like you're moving through a house. They've got a whole big selection of various rooms, and you go into kitchens and hallways and kind of like conservatory, was that what you call it? Like gardeny areas and stuff. Like areas where you're looking out and there's like maybe a backyard and a greenhouse or whatever going on. You can't really see out, but you can kind of see out. Certain rooms have like stained glass windows. One thing they had that I don't think I've seen much of since COVID was a section where you could choose to either walk through a hallway or to crawl down another path. And I think there were different scares depending on what you did. I took the easy route and just walked down the hallway. But I did watch some video of people who crawled, and it does seem like somebody pops out at you there as well. Those are a really cool set piece. I think it was there last year, but I don't think I got to see it. There's a painting like up high, like it was on almost in line with a second story, and then it pops open and somebody comes flying out over the crowds from that painting, which was definitely a cool effect. And I remembered seeing it in videos from last year after I saw it, but I was not expecting it to happen at the time. So I really absolutely love the design of this house, even though it's a little too dark, and I think all of my footage from this is pretty much unusable. So after that, I went into my first scare zone of the night, which is the only real new scare zone that they have this year, which is Sin City Zombies. My first walkthrough, I gotta say, it was during the day. It was while the sun was still out, and it wasn't very populated. It was a little lackluster. There were just a couple like random zombies stumbling around. The sets were still cool, but once night fell, this thing took off, got ramped up, and it was incredible. So the main area is like a rundown version of the Vegas Strip. Kind of looks like it might be trying to be a little more like vintage, like back in, I don't know, the 60s or something. Kind of that classic Vegas heyday that I'm not exactly sure when that was. But there's like a seedy motel, there's like a wedding chapel, there's gas pumps, there's a bunch of vehicles, like there's a bus and a car that's just covered in gore and bodies inside and out. There's a crashed airplane outside. They got bellboy zombies and magician zombies and chef zombies. But the centerpiece right in front front of the fallen down Las Vegas iconic sign is Zombie Elvis. Continuing on from this point, the layout is weird. The Sin City Zombies scare zone is kind of at the lower section of the park, leaving kind of the Egypt area, and there's a long path that goes through like the African area and all that. In the past, they have done multiple scare zones along this section. They would have one in the same place as Sin City Zombies, but then I think last year there were 2 others along this path before you get up to the Pantopia section of the park. This year, it was essentially empty after Sin City Zombies up until Pantopia. The only thing they had in there was one of the larger set pieces from the Voodoo Scare Zone from years ago, but it was just the one static set piece, nothing else. I think there might have been a couple tombstones thrown around, some other planters, but really a whole lot of nothing in this section. I don't know if this is partly because they opened up that new Serengeti Flyers ride, which does have its path come out from this section of the park, but looking at the map from last year and seeing how it's been, obviously the map is modified now to show where this ride kind of comes off the main path, I don't see the scare zone and that new path overlapping. So I don't really think it would have hurt anything with the ride to have had at least one more scare zone in this section. So eventually I got back to the Pantopia area for the next returning house, the Residence, home for the holidays. The Residence has gone through a few changes over the years, from its initial just kind of creepy House of a Thousand Corpses, Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibes thing, to this year and last having a Christmas theme. Honestly, I was kind of surprised that they kept this theme and didn't redo things. Looking at it a little more, I'm kind of thinking they may not be able to undo the Christmas theming that they did. I think some of it was kind of more permanent changes, like putting fake snow on stuff, and then other bits just being so buried into everything else, so you'd have to take the whole house apart to undo some of it. My first time going there in the night, once again, I think this was still during daylight hours. The house had 0 line. I literally walked through the line area and straight into the house without ever stopping. When I came back later in the night, the line was actually extended out. There's an extended queue off to the side. Still not a very bad wait. I probably waited maybe half an hour at worst, I think. But what I think was going on was that people who didn't get to the park right when it opened or before it opened like I did, they came in, a little bit later, did the houses up front, and then by the time I was doing my second loop, they had finally made it towards the back of the park. So the back of the park was becoming more crowded than it had been when I was there the first time. Which I did my second loop in the same order as the first. So the Circus House and Stranglewood did have relatively short lines still, but both had posted wait times that were much higher than the wait actually was. So I think this is what was going on. It was just the shifting of the load of people throughout the park. Because the way Busch Gardens is laid out, there's really no quick way to get to the back of the park. You just gotta follow the path. The house for the Residence is still really nicely designed. It brings you into the building, but then you see like the outside of the house there. You're kind of walking through the front yard. You get brought into the house through the kitchen. You go through various bedrooms and living rooms and all that stuff. Eventually you go, I think, into the basement and then the backyard and all that. It does have a cool, creepy feeling to it. Like I said, very Texas Chainsaw, House of a Thousand Corpses, that kind of gross griminess to it. And then there's a small outdoor outro section that you go through like some of the other houses. It's 90 degrees out in Florida. You're not selling me that it's Christmas. And I don't think the Christmas theming adds anything to the house really outside of just a slightly different visual aesthetic. So after that, we have the other new scare zone. This is Big Ed's Demolition Derby. The thing is, this has been a scare zone, maybe not by the same name, but it's been a scare zone in past years, but never called a scare zone as far as I'm aware. This is basically the bumper cars where they have, villains of some sort on the bumper cars with you, and they slightly theme the outside area of the bumper cars and have maybe a couple scare actors and set pieces out there. So it's usually the same thing, just I guess because there weren't zombies or clowns or zombie clowns, they decided to call it its own scare zone. But literally it was like 10 feet of theming and then you were out of the scare zone. Really nothing to it, not a whole lot of actors. At one point, one of the set pieces even had just a park employee just sitting there with his arms crossed, like leaning on the set piece. So I'm like, this is nothing. It really shouldn't be counted as a scare zone. So that's why I'm saying that they're actually down 2 scare zones, because this really shouldn't be counted. Also, the helmets that the scare actors were wearing kind of reminded me of that kid from Murder Party. Maybe a weird reference, but that's what I kept thinking. thinking when I saw it. The next scare zone was the Shortcut. This has traditionally been in that section of the park that was blank this year. They did bring in a lot of elements from the past that they've used, various like large monument, werewolf statues, gates, things like that. The problem with this scare zone for me was that the section of the park they used it in kind of went from a more narrow path and kind of ballooned out where they put the scare zone, which would make sense. They have a spot where it kind of like expands out and you have more room to move around and more room for the scare actors and set pieces. But because it started with a kind of narrow line and then ended in kind of a narrow line, I don't think people went out to the sides at all. So it became a very narrow scare zone, even though it wasn't technically a very narrow scare zone, if that makes any sense. This zone had a lot of like just random ghosts and people with like sparking shovels and stuff, basically what they've done in the past. But just the layout of it, I think it wasn't as impressive as it has been in previous years, and I just don't think it used the space quite as well. Honestly, I think what they really need to do is to put something mid-path to kind of break people up and have them move to the sides and kind of create some disruption of that flow of people going through the area, and that could have helped make it a bit scarier, a bit more interactive with the actors and everything. The next house was an update on a returning house. This was the Forgotten Uprising. I'm thinking this may be the last year for this house because they updated the interior from being vampire sex dungeon to vampire sex dungeon being invaded by vampire hunters. This haunt is built into an old ride queue area that I think the ride is long gone, but there's some theming elements outside from that they've used to their advantage, like a little cave area where they have like skeletons hanging and signs and things of like people are going into this vampire club. The outside area is kind of a walk up where they had some vehicles and I think blood bank kind of things. They have some like abandoned bikes at the side, which I think is a cool like ominous sign, like, oh, people have gone in here, and these bikes are clearly old and worn out, so like nobody ever came back out to get the bikes, so the people are just gone. They had some of the vampire hunter actors outside kind of like hyping you up. It's like the people going in here, I guess you're supposed to be helping them stake the vampires. So the first sections of it, instead of it being vampires coming at you, now it's vampire hunters like trying to hype you up, or, you know, jumping out and be like, oh wait, no, you're not a vampire, or not staking you. So the first sections of the actual vampire's lair, you can see that, I don't know how effective vampire hunters are really being, but they've at least managed to do some petty vandalism. There's paintings that are ripped up, there's graffiti on the walls, anti-vampire stuff all over the place. And then as you go deeper in, there are fewer and fewer signs of the vampire hunters, making you think that maybe they didn't make it quite as far into vampire sex dungeon as they were hoping. And the rest is kind of as it was before. Vampire sex, I keep saying vampire sex dungeon, I just keep thinking it's funny because that's really what it is. It's like an S&M club. You see people like tied up in bondage and stuff, and vampires eating them or just torturing them or whatever. Eventually you get to this throne area with the lead vampire kind of lording over everything, and exit out seeing more just dead bodies. There's kind of a gauntlet at the end as you leave too, where it's like pieces coming out at various angles, and any one of them could have another vampire behind it, so you never really know where the scare is going to come from in there. I remember not liking this house like the first time I went through it, but it's really grown on me over the years, and I'll have to admit, if this is really the last year like I'm thinking it might be, I'm going to be a little disappointed at this point. Continuing on, I got to the Raven's Mill scare zone. This was a new one last year, I believe, and it's built on this ramp area that kind of goes over what I think is a service road for employees to get into the heart of the park, to like go in and get to work or whatever. In my early years of going to Howl-O-Scream, I always thought like this area, they didn't do anything with it, and I thought it really was missing some potential that it could have had, and I love that they've now built this out. There wasn't much on the ramp itself. Once you get kind of to the top of it, they had some large sets, some various buildings, including a whole big ass windmill up there, various scarecrow kind of characters wandering around. You get the theme park haunt staple of masked dudes with chainsaws. And then you go down the bridge itself, which they've decorated out to have a bunch of lighting and jack-o'-lanterns hanging off of it and stuff. Just a really well-themed area, and I like that they've brought some life to this section of the park that previously was pretty dark. The penultimate scare zone, and the last one really on the main loop, was Beyond the Veil. Once again, I think last year was its first time. This stands out just because it is a lot of UV reactive paint, so it's dark but then glowing bits on both the sets and the characters within. Last year I was a bit disappointed with it because I felt like the characters were just a little too fantasy themed and not scary really. They seem to have adjusted that a little bit. There are a lot more kind of horrific characters than I remember from last year. Nothing too crazy, but still I think they theme better with a Halloween event now than they did last time. time. But the one thing I will say is I do miss the fog bubbles. Last year they had the fog bubble machines going on both ends of the scare zone. Not there this time, and I thought they really added something to the overall theme last time. The final house was Witch of the Woods. This has been a favorite of mine in the past. Unfortunately, they haven't done much to this house over the years, and I'm getting to the point where I just kind of know it a little too well, because I probably hit it more than I've hit any other house at the event, just because I loved it so much in previous years, but I just know it too well now. It's like a movie you've seen a million times. Like, I know what's coming, and while I can appreciate the design of everything, it's never going to scare me again. But it's really cool because you are kind of going in and out of various buildings in this area. You start off outside with this long lead up with like a house built and people hiding in the bushes and stuff. You go through and there's various like rituals and things going on. There's sections that remind me a lot of Pirates of the Caribbean. They're kind of like almost colonial, Spanish colonial style towns where you see people like hanging out of windows in distress and just things being broken apart. You go into buildings and there's, you know, people being caged or harmed or whatever. It's a whole lot of different stuff. I kind of hope they will do some kind of upgrade to it, similar to what they did with the Forgotten this year. You know, I think if they bring in a new element, a new character or something into that house for next year, they could revitalize it a little bit. I still really like it. I don't want to sound negative about it. It's just been there for 3 years now, so it is what it is, I guess. The final scare zone is the Junkyard, and just as the name implies, this is a bunch of junk from previous houses and scare zones. It's not part of the main path. It's like a little loop kind of towards the front of the park, so it almost functions as a mini haunt, where in other scare zones, it feels you can kind of wander around, don't have to take a linear path. This one I always feel like I have to just keep moving in the loop, and I know that's not true, but I always feel like I have to. Aside from rearranging a few things, I don't see much that I could recognize as being a lot different this year. And this is the scare zone I only went through once, and I think I went at a bit of a busier time. Since it wasn't the end of my loop, once again, I think this is when a lot of people were coming in and hitting the stuff right up front. So it wasn't as impactful because there were just a lot of people in there when I was there. And with any haunted attraction, the fewer people around you that aren't trying to scare you, the less impactful it's really going to be. So it's not even 9 o'clock. This opened up at 7, and I've already hit all of the haunts and scare zones, so time to go back through again. So to rank the event, I'll start with scare zones. Number 6 for me is Big Ed's Demolition Derby. Who are we kidding? This is barely a scare zone. Number 5, The Shortcut. Just knowing what it was in the past, didn't live up to what it used to be. Still fun, but just has much more potential than what they gave it this year. Number 4 is the Junkyard. Number 3 and 4 are basically going to be interchangeable for me here, but not a lot was changed with the Junkyard. It's still cool, but it definitely feels like it deserves a spot in the middle of the pack. Number 3, Beyond the Veil. While I really do like the uniqueness of the UV effects, I think they haven't fully realized what this scare zone could be. I think it has a lot of potential and they could do something really cool and creepy with it. I just don't think they're there yet. So hopefully a little more playing around with the design of it, playing around with elements, they could get something really cool, really unique out of it. But it's middle of the road right now. Number 2, Raven's Mill. I love that they use this area. I love how well themed the little set pieces are, and I just think it overall has a really cool mood. They also use the way it's set up, put different things in the path to break things up. Like I was saying, I wanted to see more with the shortcut. So it does make the area feel more interactive, feel a bit more like a maze, like you have to explore it a little bit more. So it gets higher marks for that as well. And then number 1, Sin City Zombies. It may be a little easy to be biased on it because it is the only new one. So it's the only real fresh experience I got with any of these. But I think they really did create something special here, and I do hope they'll bring that back next year and expand on it as well. As for my house rankings, number 5, I'm going to give to the Residence, Home for the Holidays. I'll say this here, none of these houses were bad. I just liked some more than others. And even going through this list, I'm like, is that really my ranking? I'm not sure. But the Residence I'll put at the bottom just because it hasn't changed much over last year. I don't really care for the Christmas theme, but I haven't said that enough already. I want Halloween at my Halloween events. I don't want Christmas. Number 4, DH Baggum's Circus of Fear. I'm never going to remember that name. I'm going to be looking at my notes every single time I say it. It was a fun house. It was well themed. I liked that it felt like you were actually traveling through the carnival itself. Like you were going in and out of buildings, all that stuff. Really well themed. It just, the missing actors in it on the night that I went definitely kind of lowered some of what it could have been. If this thing had been fully staffed, fully functional, I probably would have ranked it higher. Just my experience going through it those 2 times was not as good as it could have been. Number 3, Witch of the Woods. Again, like I said, it was just kind of the same as it has been, so it's hard to give it a higher rank, really. I don't know. I feel bad leaving it low because there's nothing wrong with it. It was missing some actors this time as well, so a couple of the scares that I knew were supposed to be there were missing, but I do want to see it get something a bit newer going forward if they decide to keep it. Number 2, The Forgotten Uprising. I really like how they applied the update to this house. I think it made it a lot of fun again. Not that it wasn't fun before, but I think it added some life to it. It actually expanded out the story of it and kind of gave it something special. In the past, I've seen them do these updates, these larger updates, I guess, where they add an additional theme to a house. I always think of Motel Hell, where they added this like infestation storyline that I felt like did nothing for it. It's like the motel's already creepy enough. You don't need to add roaches. Like, I'd expect roaches at a motel like this. But adding the vampire hunter element really kind of gave the whole house a flow that felt natural. It worked with what they had, as opposed to just doing something unnecessary or even something that hurt things. And then top spot is Stranglewood Estate. I went back and forth on this, honestly, because I don't think I could tell you any scares from it that were particularly memorable outside of the person flying out of the portrait. There was really nothing changed from last year that I remember, but the theming on this is so cool and so beautiful, and it once again feels like you're walking through a house. And you could say that about The Residents, you could say that about Circus of Fear, but it really does feel like you're just walking through this old manor. Creepy Gothic manors are such a staple of the horror genre, Gothic horror fiction, whatever. So I think just the choice of theming helps elevate it over some of those other things for me. It really feels like it's an enormous house, and if I wasn't walking back out and seeing a roller coaster 5 feet from me, I could almost believe that I was walking through some creepy old mansion. Calling it a night on Howl-O-Scream 2023. I won't get into it all here. I'll do a full conclusion in this video after the fact. But I've got to say, they've come a long way in the wrong direction since the first one I went to, which I think was in 2018, where their theme was nowhere to hide, and they made that very true, or as true as possible. There was a lot of places to hide, a lot of places with nothing happening, and a lot of places that were very bright and easy to see what was going on. I hope this year is just kind of a hiccup and that they'll come back with some better stuff in the next year. But that definitely wasn't the best Howl-O-Scream experience that I've had. So I filmed that clip right after getting out, and I've had some time to think about everything. And ironically, there was a clip I filmed way earlier in the night that I wonder if it explains some of the other stuff. So yeah, if you didn't see the kind of viral clips or whatever about it, some idiot decided they were going to get into the gator exhibit at Busch Gardens several months back, and they had to put up this big protective fence. In going through Howl-O-Scream, I noticed that there were a lot of areas where stuff wasn't there, and I don't think I actually mentioned it too much, but a lot of the areas were a lot brighter lit than they were before. In previous years, they'd keep the paths really dark, they'd have people hiding in the bushes even when it wasn't a real scare zone, so there was always kind of a sense of foreboding and just creepiness with everything because it was so dark. And what I'm thinking is the two sections I noticed the most were kind of on either side of the path that loops around, the one being the long section with no scare zones anymore, but that is by the African section. They kind of have the open plains with the animals, the train track area, all that. I don't know if those animals are out at night, but the elephants are out at night, so I'm guessing they might be. The other area where I noticed this was by the Sesame Street kids area, and usually that section's all dark, and now they actually had the Sesame Street area lit up. So what I'm wondering is if this jackass who jumps into the gator pit now has everybody worried at the park that they're going to get sued for somebody wandering into an area they shouldn't be and getting in with an animal or getting on equipment or something that they shouldn't be at. So now lights are on in more places and things are blocked off and there's no effects or anything, so that they could see better on security cameras, or the security guards would see if somebody went somewhere they aren't supposed to be. And that sucks if that's the case, because it really takes away from what was so cool about Howl-O-Scream that gave it an edge over like Halloween Horror Nights in terms of a theme park haunt, of just having that darkness and creepiness to it and that whole nowhere to hide thing. But I'm really wondering if that is what was happening. As for the lack of scare actors, I don't know. The economy sucks right now. I don't know what they were paying scare actors. It might not have been enough to entice enough people to come in and do what is a very temporary job and a pretty unforgiving job. So kind of trying to give the benefit of the doubt on this. My first loop through, I was a little upset because it did feel like a downgrade over past years, but going through the second time, I decided not to film anything in the houses and just kind of go and have fun and like let the experience kind of wash over me or whatever you want to call it. And the second run through was more fun. When I was able to just kind of focus on the houses and enjoy them for what they were, it overall felt better than when I was trying to think about making a YouTube video. So that may be a lesson I just need to learn in general. But in leaving that night and the following day, I did feel a little bit negative about how the event went. But the more I think about it, the more I think there are reasons probably for why things were the way they were. And while I don't have to like that those things happened, I could just hope that maybe next year will be a return to form of what I like to see out of Howl-O-Scream. And since there are so few new houses, and a lot of those houses have been around for multiple years, I'd have to hope we're at least going to get maybe 2 new ones next year, because some of them are just getting a bit old. Or like I said, I'm down with the rethemes too, if you just retheme it well. But that's going to do it for this one. I think I've talked way longer than I ever anticipated I was going to talk on this. I was trying to write a script and make this video a little bit shorter, and I think I failed at that 100%. So I'm going to cut it there, and I will see you all in the next one.